Ashveil's full kit has finally been revealed, and surprise surprise, he is not an Elation character. If you'd shown me his kit before we knew what the Elation path did though, then I might have thought he was an Elation character, because Elation's whole gimmick in Divergent Universe is follow-up attacks. And lo and behold, Ashveil's whole gimmick is also follow-up attacks. But alas, he is not Elation. Ashveil is a Lightning Hunt character, and you may be thinking, wait, we already have a Lightning Hunt character who does follow-up attacks, Moza. And the comparison is very appropriate. Ashveil does, in some ways, feel like a 5-star Moza, not necessarily in playstyle, but certainly in role. So let's go over Ashveil's kit, what teams he seems to be made for, and how good he seems at the current moment. For starters, we've already discussed how he's similar to Moza in that he's a follow-up attack sub-DPS character. But how does he fulfill this role? His basic attack is just a regular single target hit of lightning damage, so you'll ideally never be using this. His skill marks one enemy target as bait, and then does damage to them, which is fairly similar to Topaz and Moza's skills, who also mark a target and deals damage to them. If Ashveil targets an enemy who is already marked as bait, he simply deals more damage and also recovers one skill point, essentially making him skill point neutral, so long as he's always using his skill on the target already marked as bait. Ashveil also automatically selects the enemy target with the lowest HP to be the bait if no current enemy is marked, so there will always be a bait enemy, meaning Ashveil ideally should never have to use skill points unless you want to change the bait enemy to a different target. When his currently marked enemy dies, again, the bait will automatically be moved to the next enemy with the lowest HP. Even juicier, while there's an enemy on the field marked by bait, which will always be the case, since bait will always automatically target an enemy, Ashveil reduces the defense of all enemies on the field by 40%. That's 40% team-wide defense dread for completely free, with 100% uptime, forever. That's a whole Nihility character disguised as a hunt unit. That's almost a whole Pella ultimate right there on his skill. Additionally, when Ashveil uses his skill, he gains 1 stack of charge. Let's go down to his talent to discuss what his stacks of charge do before we circle back around to his ultimate. Ashveil's talent lets him start the battle with 3 stacks of charge, stacking up to 5. Think of these stacks of charge as being similar to Cypher's follow-up attack, where basically, when an ally attacks the enemy Ashveil has marked as bait, Ashveil will launch a follow-up attack while consuming one of his charges. When he launches a follow-up attack via his talent, he also gains a stack of Gluttony, stacking up to 12, which he'll utilize in his ultimate. Speaking of Ashveil's ultimate, it's essentially a massive single target nuke with a pretty hefty 160 energy cost. His ultimate gives him 2 charge, aka 2 stacks of his follow-up attack at the ready. His ultimate also automatically makes him launch one of his follow-up attacks at the cost of no charge, sort of like how Moza's ultimate also makes him instantly launch his follow-up attack. But wait, there's more! Remember those stacks of Gluttony Ashveil gets whenever he launches his follow-up attack? Well, when he uses his ultimate, he consumes 4 points of Gluttony to deal another big nuke of damage. For every 4 points of Gluttony he has, he will continue consuming them to keep doing more instances of damage. So if you stack his Gluttony to the maximum of 12, then he can consume 4 stacks of Gluttony 3 different times, dealing 3 extra big hits of damage in his ultimate. If he kills the enemy target marked as bait with one of these attacks, he'll simply switch targets to the next bait and keep consuming Gluttony to deal damage to the next target. In terms of damage multipliers, his current numbers are even higher than Fei Xiao's, though it should be noted that Fei Xiao is capable of spamming her ultimate very frequently with the right teammates, so she can certainly make up for the fact that her numbers are smaller. The point being, his numbers are very good, and while I opened this video up by calling him a sub DPS, he has good enough numbers to function as a main DPS as well. As for how good he is as a main DPS, that'll require more testing, but regardless, he's going to be dishing out some very respectable damage of his own. Now, let's dive into his sub DPS capabilities and his bonus abilities. First of all, Ashveil's first bonus ability gives him 1 Gluttony stack when he uses his skill, and 2 Gluttony stacks when he uses his ultimate. Additionally, whenever his follow-up attack kills an enemy, including his follow-up attack in his ultimate, he gains 1 stack of Gluttony, meaning theoretically if he kills enough enemies when he chains his follow-up attacks in his ultimate by consuming Gluttony stacks, he can refund himself enough Gluttony stacks for an extra follow-up attack. This gives him some potential in AoE scenarios and pure fiction, despite being a hunt unit, and overall is just a really cool mechanic to let him take advantage of getting kills. His second and third bonus abilities are where his sub DPS capabilities really shine through though. We've covered all the ways in which he does damage, but as a sub DPS, he needs to bring buffs to the team as well, and boy does Ashveil bring some hefty buffs. His second bonus ability buffs the follow-up attack damage of all allies by 80%, just for Ashveil existing, no conditions. Additionally, whenever Ashveil launches a follow-up attack, he regenerates 3 additional energy for himself. This really helps Ashveil's large 160 energy cost not be nearly as problematic as it otherwise would be, since he's spamming his skill and follow-up attacks and getting extra energy from his follow-up attacks. Lastly, his third bonus ability gives 40% crit damage to the entire team for completely free, and then he gives an additional 80% crit damage buff to ally follow-up attacks, adding up to a whopping 120% crit damage to the entire team's follow-up attacks. So yeah, that's a lot. Let's summarize the buffs Ashveil is giving to the team. He gives 40% reduced defense to all enemies with no conditions and permanent uptime. He gives 80% damage bonus to all ally follow-up attacks. And he gives 40% crit damage to the entire team, increasing to 120% crit damage for follow-up attacks specifically. All of his buffs are team-wide. All of his buffs are unconditional and permanent. He does all of this just for existing. And his damage multipliers are even higher than Fei Xiao's. Albeit Fei Xiao can spam her ultimate more often, especially if she has Ashvale on the team feeding her ultimate stacks, with the amount of follow-up attacks Ashvale is launching. Ashvale feels like the Evernight of follow-up attacks with his effortless team-wide buffs and massive personal damage. He's giving so many stats for completely free while having good damage. And while it might feel like he's just completely overshadowing Fei Xiao, he also offers everything Fei Xiao could possibly want. Again, Fei Xiao will catch up to his damage multipliers thanks to the amount of buffs he's giving her, along with Ashvale helping Fei Xiao spam her ultimate much more frequently. Additionally, Fei Xiao reaches 94% defense ignore with her signature light cone and Ashvale. Yes, you heard that right, 94%. I definitely expect Ashvale to be a massive buff to Fei Xiao, while also being able to stand on his own, but we'll touch more on his potential teams later. Ashvale has 3 offensive stat bonuses, which is nice compared to, once again, Fei Xiao, who has a useless defense stat bonus. For Ashvale's Eidolons, his E1 is another unconditional 24% vulnerability debuff, which does conditionally increase to a 36% vulnerability debuff if enemies are below 80% HP, which, let's be honest, is going to be most of the battle. 24 to 36% vulnerability is pretty damn strong for an E1, comparable to Robin's E1, for example. His E2 is really interesting, increasing the max stacks of Gluttony from 12 to 18. Additionally, he refunds 35% of the Gluttony stacks consumed every time he unleashes his follow-up attack from his ultimate, letting him chain even more follow-up attacks during his ultimate. The E3 and E5 are just talent levels, as always. His E4 is a very simple attack buff when he uses his ultimate. The E6 is also quite simple, giving 20% all-type res pen, which is the classic E6, as well as increasing his damage dealt based on the amount of Gluttony stacks he's gotten throughout the battle, up to a permanent 90% damage bonus. His later Eidolons are pretty underwhelming, but his early ones are admittedly pretty powerful, with his E2 being entirely a personal damage Eidolon. His Eidolons aren't needed by any means though. Ashvale's kit at a baseline already gives so many stats to the entire team's follow-up attacks, as well as having really high multipliers himself. As for his signature light cone, it gives Ashvale a large amount of crit rate. Then, at the start of battle or after performing 4 follow-up attacks, which isn't too difficult for Ashvale, he enters the Umbra Devourer state, which gives him 40% attack and reduces the defense of all enemies by 12%, as if he needed even more defense thread in his kit. No, seriously, Fei Xiao is overcapping on defense thread by quite a bit if she has her own signature light cone with Ashvale, which makes Ashvale's light cone a bit overkill for me in Fei Xiao teams. I would definitely recommend his E1 over his S1 in the current state. His light cone is fairly universal for the other follow-up attack characters as well though, so that's pretty neat. The other follow-up attack hunt light cones are also universal for Ashvale to use. Topaz's light cone is really good on him, giving the same amount of crit rate as well as team-wide buffs. For Ashvale's damage specifically, Ratio's light cone seems perfect for him, since it buffs follow-up attacks after using the ultimate, which is exactly what Ashvale wants. So if you already have either of those, you really don't need Ashvale's light cone. Free-to-play light cone options are the usual hunt options, like the Hurdle Shot light cone or swordplay. Now to touch upon his team options, where I expect him to be played, and how good he seems to be. We briefly touch upon all of these things throughout this video, but to summarize, Ashvale is a follow-up attack sub DPS due to the amount of buffing in his kit. So if you're going to take advantage of that, you're going to want to run him with another damage dealer. However, the only one I would truly recommend at the current moment would be Fei Xiao. He gives Fei Xiao everything she would want, and Fei Xiao's frequent attacks are also good for triggering Ashvale's follow-up attacks as well. I'll need to do more testing to decide on the best options to round out this team, but you can't go wrong with the likes of Cypher and Robin, the usual follow-up attack buffers. The reason I'm skeptical of using Ashvale with the likes of Dr. Ratio or Jing Yuan, who also deal most of their damage through their follow-up attacks and thus make use of Ashvale's buffs, is simply because I'm fairly certain you would get better results if you just run main DPS Ashvale instead. His numbers are really high, higher than Fei Xiao's without Fei Xiao spamming her ultimates, which again, Ashvale helps her with. So tying Ashvale down to Ratio or Jing Yuan is probably just kneecapping him. Of course, if you want to make a team like this, go for it, but you're really probably better off just ditching the second DPS at that rate and focusing all in on Ashvale's own damage. Yun Li is another promising teammate, but we'll have to wait and see if she does enough damage to carry her own weight in an Ashvale team, or if he'll still be better off just being played as a hypercarry. Which brings us to the topic of hypercarry Ashvale. I really do think Ashvale is very similar to Anaxa in Evernight, where he's a sub DPS who is perfectly competent in the main DPS role. As for how good he is at it, again, I'm going to need to do personal testing to get a feel for it, but since this is just my first impressions, I'll just say that this character has a ton of potential. Anaxa and Evernight are some of my favorite characters in terms of role design due to their ability to be sub DPSs while also being independent and flexible enough to stand on their own. This is also what I've hoped and suspected Sparksy to be, but But Ashvale is even more blatant in his dual role due to the sheer amount of team-wide stat buffs in his kit, and I'm really excited to see all the different things this character can pull off. But until I get to try him out, I can't go too in-depth into his specific team building and what feels best for him. Once I do manage to get a feel for Ashvale, I will definitely be making a follow-up video. Get it? A follow-up video. Updating you guys on my more in-depth thoughts on Ashvale with a much more fully formed opinion on him. So subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on that, as well as more Ashvale content coming out. And like the video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. Strength aside, Ashvale just looks super fun, and I cannot wait to discuss this character even more in the future. With all of that said, thank you so much for watching, and until next time!